I want to switch between German and English, if that is fine. Yeah? Okay. Actually, I thought maybe we start with the question Tobias had. Last question, like how do you actually work with the region around the city? As we know that you all, like, wir haben jetzt heute die ganzen Städte gesehen, die ja sozusagen ja, ihr habt euch alle auf die Städte konzentriert und wie geht man eigentlich innerhalb der Stadtgrenzen mit dem Wachstum um, aber auch mit Klimawandel, also wie kann man da sozusagen Maßnahmen treffen, aber alle Städte sind ja nicht unabhängig. Und ich fände es ganz spannend, vielleicht könnt ihr einmal kurz so ein Schlaglicht drauf werfen, welche Rolle sozusagen der Umgang mit der Stadtregion für eure Projekte auch spielt, eben auch, wenn man das gerade gesehen hat am Beispiel der Magistralen oder eben auch der Straßen. Du hattest auch erklärt, dass das eigentlich nur ging, weil ihr wisst, dass die Autos gar nicht durch die Stadt müssen, sondern eigentlich auch außen rumfahren können. Das sind ja dann auch Bewegungen, die sozusagen von außen kommen. Also wie das einmal eure Planung beeinflusst und wie ihr damit umgeht. Should I say it in English again or is it fine? Yeah? Okay. Would you start?
Yeah, I work for the municipality, and of course you have a bigger region. The strategy to densify the city and to combine it with public transport, that is an agreement on a regional level. So together with all the other municipalities along these existing public transport lines, we made sort of a proposal also to the province and to the national government. Well, this is our bit where we combine development together with the public transport. So that was on a regional level. Also on a regional level, we try to make agreements on especially on affordable housing, since we have a lot of social housing. A lot of the surrounding municipalities, although they have to, they did not develop social housing. And we try to make that into a better balance. Just last month, the national government said every municipality has to have 30% social housing. Which means for some municipalities that all they develop has to be social housing because they didn't have any. So we make agreements on the regional level on that as well. Of course, also we have water boards that are working over the boundaries of municipalities. So you've got different layers that work on the regional level, but most is done within the municipality. But on transport and the bigger aim for development in the far future about housing is done on the regional level.
Maybe Kristiaan?
Yeah, I must say that I really enjoyed your part on Umland or suburbia, I guess. Even if you were regretting all of the time that you couldn't show cool pictures of nice towers and so on. Because I think it's the issue of the future. So you could say that inner city renewal, 19th century urban tissue renewal, up to a certain level, we know how to do that, So there are recipes and there's necessity and there's still a lot of work to be done. But the big question is what we call in my country the 20th century belt. So the urban fabric that was built in the second half after the World War, in the second half of the 20th century. And we know that it will have to be renewed as well, because it's outdated on the level of energy, for instance, insulation and so on. The generation that has been building it is dying. It needs densification, and indeed, if you then introduce new ways of organizing public transport, you need to intensify those points. So it's a big issue in my country. I didn't tell about it, so I've been working in Antwerp and I've been making a plea for organizing indeed a research project on the 20th century build, because the first thing to do is to understand it. in order to, before intervening. So I think it's one of the issues of the future, indeed.
Yeah, maybe just one point on that. Obviously the demographics are changing, so you're right, and there's been a bit of a sort of move out of post-COVID for people to want to live a bit further in green areas. So there's a sort of garden suburb renewal, and we've got one project which I didn't show today, Gartenstadt Oehendorf, which is trying to look at a kind of slightly villagey, Hackney-esque, as I call it, place that is a bit more middle class in that it reinvents the idea of a green suburb that has got social housing as well, but it also is much more bicycle based, and even though the access will never be as good as being in the centre, there won't always be an S-Bahn station. You have to look at other mobility opportunities, and in Hamburg we've got city-owned companies set up that, for example, Moya provide an electric minibus system to access those areas that aren't served as well by rail-based public transport. That would be not feasible for bus systems to go there either. So it's just branching out mobility from electric scooters to city-sponsored discounted taxi-type arrangements to get elderly ladies and women and kids back to their houses from the S-Bahn station. So there's a lot more that can be done. And so I think you're absolutely right. The next step for us really is to make sense of suburbia from a design point of view, to make it better, to make it perform better, and to also start to take some of those structures out and renew them over time. And that will be the challenge, because people are quite wedded to the concept of their own single family home and the garden, and not just in Germany or in England, but anywhere really.
Maybe that's a good question to follow, actually, because you had the slogan, "Let's make the city together," and I think you all said, okay, we have a diverse, or Brussels is a diverse city, and I wondered, how do you actually approach the population within your plans? Like, how do you make that people, do you make people follow you, or is it that you start working with them? Like I think Kristiaan said, as a Bouwmeester, it's very important to be very early in the process to get things going or to shape things. So what kind of approach do you follow when it's about, let's say, participative planning, or really let's do things together, and actually what parts can actually the civil society do in urban development in your cities? Could you explain that a bit?
Yeah, well, it's always a struggle, you could say, because a recipe for one neighborhood can be a recipe for disaster in another neighborhood. What we try to do is at least talk about the bigger scheme. That is really easy to talk with people about. So one of the images I showed about that port area, it's not approved on yet, but we did discuss it with the adjacent neighborhood and also with all the entrepreneurs working in the area. And that really helped, because they had an idea of where the whole area would go to, instead of they would discuss a high-rise tower which would come there anyway. So I think that helps, and that is something that we as a city have to work on, to know at what stage do you talk about the people. And we think, especially from an urban design point of view, you don't want to talk about all this single project, you want to talk about a bigger area or a neighborhood, and that is the scale where you can have a good contact with the people living in that area. On the other hand, we have a lot of debate and meetings with professional parties in our city, to also talk with them, housing corporations, developers, investors, cultural entrepreneurs, and so on. So it's about the people living in the area, but also all the other people that work in our city. So that's both that we do, but it is, if you just show them the project, quite often then you get a lot of people that are against. If you tell the bigger picture and show them, and it's not all detailed yet or designed yet, that really helps. That's at least what we experience.
I'm interested how you take people along in your projects where you use the urban, a productive city, where you have to probably do some persuasion, because I don't think people will naturally always understand the idea of that mezzanine floor, and you take the car parking out later, and also developers who will probably not be used to the idea of stacking. So I'm quite jealous of the projects there, because I think we can do engagement, we do participation. We have these Stadtwerkstatt formats where we get people in the room early. We have digital participation tools, DPAS, which we have just sort of copyrighted ourselves and use it as a product. And so I think we've got the right tools to engage. We do find that we get the same people to come to these things. You know, the same obvious candidates who love to come to these evening events. So we're trying to mix it more up and find ways of getting young people, getting people who don't live in these areas to come. And particularly with that Magistral Master Plan, where we are facing the biggest consultation exercise ever, because we have to go and see all the districts in the spring, all their planning committees. We have to see the politicians. We have to talk to every single kind of a group, from the architects' chambers to the arts and crafts people. So it's going to be a real challenge. So I'm slightly worried that we'll just end up talking and talking, but not really getting the inputs. So we want to get decent inputs and engage with the people who we want to engage with. And I think that's the harder job. So I'd be interested in, Kristiaan, what you think. How do you get these projects embedded? Because people will probably look at them and they go like, I don't fancy that, or I want something else, or I want the more usual urban type.
Without answering in a too cynical way, I would say people go and live there, perhaps not by choice, but by default, because there is scarcity, and it's affordable housing. So that's one thing. It's also about, on the other hand, it's also about explaining, indeed, and there's also about changing the mentality, because in the city we are used of accepting the nuisances of, for instance, restaurants and bars, and we, okay, that's normal, you have real city life, you have to tolerate that. But in fact, the noise of a bar and the noise of, for instance, a ventilation system of a restaurant in the inside of an urban block could be as important as a small company. Even some of those small businesses make less noise than that kind of activities. So it's also about shifting the mentality. And of course they all will have to have an environmental permit, so all of these things are okay. And it's also true, it's changing developers, because developers were used of building one standard product, only apartments, or only offices, or only productive economy buildings, but then out of the city. And now they are forced to combine different programs, so, but they are adapting and they're learning. So partly because they have to, because in those areas, so I can organize these competitions, because the land use is compulsory mixed use. So it's not always about convincing and seducing, it's also sometimes about hard power. Just one word on civil society. I think that is a challenge. I could say perhaps that in the last 20 years, I think the professionalism of planning and urban design has risen. And in fact, the methods of participation and consultation are lacking behind. There are still the traditional methods. So there's a lot of work to do. And it's going difficult in Brussels. There is a lot of protest, there are a lot of citizens' committees. Also, and that is interesting, not always against something, no tram in my street, but also in favor of something. We want more clean air. And so that's quite interesting to use also. Also for politicians or for professionals as me also, I was trained in another era. We have to adapt that the people who make the cities is not anymore just public authority or professional developers and so, but it's also these new kind of agents. In many cases, the civil society, the citizens' associations are very professional. In many cases, some people of my team, after work hours, are in citizens' association. In many cases, it's architects and urban planners also. So we have to work with them.
Thanks. I have two more questions. Like one is a quite detailed question. I wonder, because you showed, like of course it's planning, so you showed the previous image and then the after image, or the image to come. And I wonder, for example, you had the street, I think it was maybe Coke Street or Clark Street, like a small citizens, small street space. And it was completely changed. And I wondered, how do you finance these things? Like you said, 90% is actually maintenance, so you can do small things there, but this was quite a huge change. So do you actually have the people, like the owners, at the, I think in Germany you would probably have the owners to pay a little bit for the infrastructure you do. So how do you do that?
The citizens don't pay. It's also in an area where I think the average income of that neighborhood is 17,000 euros per year. So they don't have the money. So maintenance is key. So we have a program of renew 40 kilometers of sewer every year. And when you take out the sewer system, which is in the street, we now have an agreement that we don't put in a new sewer, but from the facade on one side and the facade on the other side, you look at the renewing of the whole street profile. So there's a big, planning machine behind it, also with all the logistics of the electrics and heating and so on. But that is one thing that we working on and is now more or less the standard. So that helps. For this particular one, more expensive indeed. We had a philanthropic organization that did some co-sponsoring. So there we were lucky, but in general, because here you had also the concrete benches all around these nice green areas, which is quite expensive. But in general, we try to get some if maintenance is not enough, get some extra funding to realize these sort of images. So it's also about combining financial flows at a certain time, and then you can achieve quite a lot. But there's a lot of money going on in maintenance. People quite often forget that. So once you are aware of that, you can use it in your advantage instead of arguing why does it have to open again. So yeah, that is what we try to do. And also a house is an asset. And now we say a street is an asset as well, for us as the maintenance department of our municipality. And so they can always, they can have these financial schemes and put in their assets of the street in that as well. That helps too.
Okay, that's so smart that it works that way. I thought maybe, I don't know if there are any questions, but not really. No? Right one? Yeah? Can I use that? So some movement. I think it's already on.
Thank you. Thank you for this fantastic insights in your work. And I just have a question concerning your role or your understanding of the role. In some parts it became clear, but I just want to make, maybe for us here, as you having as a guest here, to get a bit deeper. How do you define your role in terms of authority on the one hand. You said like in Rotterdam you have the same, let's say like rules as 20, 30 years ago. You trigger the investors to say, okay, you can build the double. I think this is the typical architectural cheesy trick. So like, okay, you can build a double, but you have to do it in a different way, not to double the amount of retail and industrial plants. So this is, I think, the authority way. You have the law and the building permits, and say, okay, you have the zoning law, and then on the other hand, you were mentioning the soft power. So, in terms of negotiation, in terms of convincing, persuading, I like to know how you work, or maybe are there new ways of defining your attitude towards planning regarding the negotiation of the spaces which can be developed by others, but who are still more interested, even they need to make money because of the shareholder value, you know, like that they won't be, I don't know, persuaded in terms of, okay, street is something I want to pay for, you know, I want to pay for building and I want to get the money out of it, so, because I have so many shareholders in my back, sorry.
Okay, so it's a bit the question, how do you work between soft power and hard power, and how do you convince shareholder companies who actually develop the city?
Yeah.
So what would you, Kristiaan, maybe we can start?
So there is of course no precise answer, because especially in soft power it's about negotiating and so on. So about, I think perhaps one leverage, because in my role it's negotiating with developers, private parties, but also negotiating with politicians. For politicians, the fact that the Bouwmeester is connected to civil society, and sometimes I translate, in fact, concerns of civil society to politicians, and in private, behind the screen, I can say to them, look, what they're saying, let's just agree among us, it's not stupid. So that's the first step, so that they accept in some way on the level of content, and then perhaps they will not decide to do it because of budget, or because politically they want to do something else, and so on. So, but that helps. With private developers, perhaps that's an interesting point. For me, there is a big difference between local developers, even if it's big companies with shareholders, structures, and so on. So in Brussels, most of them are still Belgian companies. Where I'm working in Amsterdam, it's international money. It's a Korean fund with a Russian representative coming to Amsterdam. And so I have to confess that then soft power convincing doesn't work. They just say, what's in the planning legislation? Is what you're saying, is that in the planning legislation? Is that in the rules? No, okay. And so with a kind of more local company, you can also, they have their reputation, they want to do something for the city, they know that they will be working there on the long term, so they want, sometimes they're also interested in quality, they're not always bad guys. So, but I'm really worried about the financialization of the housing sector, especially when dwellings become a commodity. Then it's much more difficult to work on quality.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's the essence of what we do in different ways, trying to get good results. There's leverage by just being in a position, working your way up the greasy pole into a place where you can actually people listen to you. We've probably all spent time doing things still with leverage, but not really as successful because we weren't running teams in municipalities. But in the end, it's always a negotiation, understanding what the other side of the table wants, and yes, the local developers will be more amenable to a long-term investment because they are there, they're present, they want to see, they want to be part of the results, and I think the market is, I've seen market going up and down in different ways, and it always means there's suddenly, right now there's a lot of people who used to turn a quick buck on buying large sites and then sitting on them, running around, coming back to us saying, "Do you want to buy that?" Because they can't make money on that investment anymore on the quick dollar. So it's hopefully the economic decline and the change in the costs of building certainly forcing a sea change in terms of how us as the public sector look at land. So a lot of cities have sold off too much land. Hamburg's been really lucky to hold on to it, but still we've let a few opportunities slip by. The Holsten brewery site, for example, the city should have bought it. Now it's worth, I don't know, 5 times as much as even what the developer can ever get back from it. So we're in a really strange place. But I think negotiating through leverage, getting people to understand what the benefits are from doing something slightly over the odds and doing something special, perhaps introducing a kind of use into their building that they hadn't thought about, like the plumber example. That's really the art of, I think, getting the cities to change, and the art of what we do in our everyday life, whether it's through the power of the plan, or the power of being able to say no, or the power of just being linked to some politicians who can make stuff happen, even though they themselves don't always have the power. Yeah, and translating, for people to like you said, to actually translate an idea from an early sketch into a vision, being able to see that and communicate it, because people won't necessarily buy into the whole idea of reuse if we don't actively enforce that. The idea of recycling materials, and that powerful picture you showed, it's really impressive, isn't it, of that school or that historic building being put into parts, being sold off again. That's where we need to get to.
Yeah, well, I think soft power is really important. So in Rotterdam we have a lot of debate with a certain group which consists of developers, investors and housing corporations, and some people from the municipality, and I'm part of that as well. And then you discuss things, or you try to engage them, and that really helps. And then a week after or a month after, you see them in a project, and they say, "Hey, do you remember what we talked about?" "Oh, yeah, I know." And it's always good to have some hard power behind, but in the case of these office buildings, we didn't know the owners, because it were small 80s office buildings, and we didn't really know, and we couldn't get them moving, because we couldn't get in touch. So therefore we said, well, it's also a strategic location. We just start making a master plan of what we think is good. So it was our plan, and in the end, of course, because we wanted to densify, that was a trigger for the owners. But what they did is they just sold their buildings. And then now we're working with developers and investors that we know, because they know what we want in Rotterdam. So it's, and then you have the zoning plan and so on, but the soft power, I think, is really important, especially from a designer's point of view. You have to convince people. Quite often people say, yeah, urban design, everyone knows urban design. Well, of course it isn't. You have to study hard, but it seems sometimes like that. But in the end, everything, well, perhaps robots will take over at some stage, but beforehand it's working with people, and then the soft skills, soft power is really important.
I think that was a quite nice saying, working with people is soft power maybe. urban planning and urban development. So since we are already getting some fewer and fewer, and then we would like to maybe end the official part now over here, and would like to thank you all for the audience and for listening, and thank you very much for really interesting input and insights, also like behind the scenes, which we probably usually don't get. And yeah, we can have some small drinks, but I would like to do some drinks, and just say a big thank you, and I hope to talk to you soon again, or to invite you soon again to learn more. Great. Thank you.